The ultrasound photo was on the refrigerator for 11 weeks. I know the exact number because I counted backward later, sitting at my kitchen table with a glass of whiskey I wasn't drinking, doing the kind of arithmetic that destroys you quietly. 11 weeks of walking past that image every morning, grainy, black and white, the unmistakable comma shape of a fetus curled in the dark, and feeling something I can only describe as terrified joy. The specific joy of a man who didn't know he wanted a child until he was told one was coming. 11 weeks of believing my wife. My name is Ethan. I was 37 years old when it happened. I'm an architect. I design buildings for a living, which means I spend my days thinking about structure and load-bearing capacity and what holds things up under pressure. I was not, apparently, applying any of those skills to my marriage. Her name is Natalie. We'd been together for 8 years, married for 5. She was 34, a hospital administrator, which, I would later understand, was the specific cruelty at the center of everything. She knew exactly how medical paperwork looked. She knew what a real ultrasound scan contained, what details made it convincing, what a 12-week appointment actually involved. She had access, through her work, to the language and the aesthetics of medical reality. She used all of it. We'd been having problems. That's the part one always have to say first, because without it nothing else makes sense, and with it everything makes a terrible kind of sense. We'd been discussing separation, not loudly, not dramatically, the way it happens in films. Quietly. The way people who are fundamentally decent to each other begin the conversation about whether they should still be together. We'd had 3 of those conversations in the month before she told me she was pregnant, each one ending without resolution, each one leaving a specific residue of unfinished grief. Then she sat across from me at the kitchen table one Tuesday evening and said the words. I remember her face when she said them. She was holding a mug of tea she wasn't drinking, and she looked, I thought, frightened. The way a person looks when they're delivering news that will change everything. The way someone looks when they're telling the truth about something enormous. I reached across the table and took her hand. I said, okay, we'll figure it out. We'll be okay. The relief on her face was so complete, so total, that I thought it was love. I was wrong about what it was. 3 months later, 11 weeks after that ultrasound photo went on the refrigerator, for weeks after we'd told both families, 2 weeks after I'd quietly withdrawn the separation conversation from the air between us as though it had never happened, I found a receipt in the glove compartment of our shared car that made no sense. It was for a medical consultation, private clinic, a specialist I didn't recognize. The date on it was 6 days before Natalie had told me she was pregnant. To understand what those 11 weeks felt like from the inside, you have to understand what kind of man I am in a crisis. I stabilize. It's a professional reflex that has migrated into my personality. When things become uncertain, I become methodical. I make lists. I research. I plan. When Natalie told me she was pregnant, I went into a quiet, focused mode of preparation that looked, from the outside, like a man who had decided entirely. I bought 3 books on fatherhood. I researched pediatricians in our area. I started mentally redesigning the second bedroom, smaller, currently used as a dumping ground for things we hadn't unpacked from the last move, into something suitable. I stopped thinking about leaving. That's the thing I have to be honest about. I had been ready to leave. Not with certainty, not without grief, but with the quiet resignation of someone who has tested a structure and found it load-bearing in fewer places than hoped. And then the pregnancy arrived, and something in me simply rerouted. Because whatever was wrong between Natalie and me, a child felt like the kind of thing you stayed for. The kind of thing that reorganized your priorities without asking permission. She seemed changed by it too. That's what made it convincing beyond the paperwork. Natalie in those 11 weeks was softer, more present. She'd struggled with a kind of emotional distance for the last year of our marriage. A remoteness I'd attributed to work stress, to the cumulative weight of being a hospital administrator during a period of institutional chaos, to the ordinary erosion of intimacy in a marriage that had stopped receiving maintenance. But after the announcement, she was warmer. She reached for me in the mornings before either of us had spoken. She was interested in my projects again, asking about the building I was designing for a client in the north of the city, following the details with what felt like genuine curiosity. She was, I now understand, performing gratitude. The physical reality of the pregnancy was where her knowledge served her. She worked at the hospital, which meant she kept odd hours. Mint appointments could happen at times I'd simply trust without verification. She complained of nausea in the mornings. Not dramatically, not consistently enough to seem performed, just occasionally, the kind of nausea that comes and goes and that a person manages privately. She declined wine at dinner. She went to bed earlier. She bought prenatal vitamins that sat on the bathroom shelf in full visibility. She had thought about this carefully. The first sign I missed was the appointment. At 12 weeks, there's a scan, a nuchal translucency scan, a standard procedure. She told me she'd booked it for a Tuesday at 11, that it was at a clinic rather than the hospital because she didn't want to deal with colleagues, that she'd let me know how it went. I offered to come. She said it would be quick, routine, that I didn't need to take time off work, that there would be bigger appointments later. I accepted this. I was in the middle of a complex planning approval, and I was grateful, slightly, for the permission not to reorganize my day. She came home that afternoon with the skin photo. It was printed on that specific paper, thermal, slightly waxy, and it had the clinic's header across the top and the measurements along the side and everything that a scan photo contains. She was smiling when she handed it to me. The smile was real. I've thought about that smile many times since, trying to understand what was behind it, whether it was performance or relief or something more complicated. I put the photo on the refrigerator with a magnet shaped like a city skyline we'd bought on our first trip to Barcelona. I stood back and looked at it, and I felt the weight of it, this small black and white image of a person who didn't exist yet. And I thought, this is real now. What I didn't think to do, what I had no framework for thinking to do, was question whether the scan was genuine. It didn't occur to me that the woman I'd been married to for 5 years, who worked in healthcare, who had a face I knew like my own, might have sourced a false skin photo from somewhere I couldn't imagine. It should have. The second sign was her friend Priya. Priya had been Natalie's closest friend since university, the kind of friend who appears at every significant moment, who has opinions about everything and expresses them without restraint. I liked Priya. She was direct in a way I found refreshing, and she'd always been warm to me in the particular way of someone who has genuinely approved of their friend's partner. She came for dinner about 6 weeks after the announcement. She brought wine, which she immediately acknowledged was tactless given the circumstances, and laughed about, and then drank most of herself. We had a pleasant evening. But twice during dinner, I caught Priya looking at Natalie with an expression I couldn't immediately categorize. Not warm. Not concerned exactly. Something more watchful. After dinner, while I was in the kitchen washing up, I heard them in the hallway. Low voices. I couldn't make out words, only tone, and the tone was serious. And then there was a silence, and then Priya's voice again, a single sentence I didn't catch, and Natalie's response. I know what I'm doing. I assumed they were talking about the pregnancy, about the timing, the complications with our relationship, the fact that Natalie and I had been on uncertain ground before this happened. I didn't consider the other possibility. The receipt was for a clinic called the Meridian Center. Private. Specialist consultations, the category listed. The amount was consistent with a one-time appointment rather than ongoing treatment. The date, 6 days before Natalie told me she was pregnant, was precise and irrefutable. I sat in the car park outside the supermarket where I'd found it, the engine running, the receipt in my hand, and I tried to construct the innocent explanation. The most obvious one was that she'd known she was pregnant before she told me, that she'd seen a private specialist to confirm it, or to discuss something about the pregnancy she'd wanted to understand privately first. This was possible, completely possible. People process significant news in their own time before sharing it, and Natalie was a private person in certain specific ways. But she'd framed the announcement as something she'd just discovered. She'd been holding the test, she'd said. She'd just taken it that morning. I drove home and put the receipt in my jacket pocket and said nothing. For the next week, I was conducting an internal negotiation I've since come to recognize as the early stage of suspicion, the phase in which you're simultaneously building the case and dismantling it, trying to be fair to both possibilities. I didn't want to be the kind of man who accused his pregnant wife of something without grounds. I also couldn't quiet the specific dissonance that receipt had introduced. I started paying a different kind of attention, not dramatic surveillance, just the natural heightening of observation that comes when something doesn't add up. I noticed that Natalie never mentioned symptoms in the specific way pregnant women talk about their bodies, not the particular discomforts, the internal geography of it. She mentioned nausea in the abstract. She mentioned tiredness in the general. But when I asked questions, and I started asking, carefully, the way you ask when you're trying to sound casual, her answers had a slightly rehearsed quality. Like she'd prepared the vocabulary, but not the depth. I mentioned this to my brother, Tom. I framed it as mild worry rather than suspicion. Said Natalie seemed stressed, that I wasn't sure she was taking care of herself. Tom asked if she'd had a midwife appointment yet. I said I wasn't sure. He said that by 10, 11 weeks that should have happened. I went home and asked Natalie about it. She said she'd registered with a midwife, someone at the hospital, a colleague she trusted, and that the first proper appointment was coming up next week. She showed me an entry in her phone calendar. The appointment was real, logged, time-stamped. I felt the suspicion deflate slightly. See, I told myself, you're spiraling. But 3 days later, something happened that I couldn't rationalize away. I was working late. The planning approval was dragging. My client was anxious. I'd been putting in 12-hour days and coming home after Natalie had gone to bed. At around 9 in the evening, my phone rang. Unknown number. I let it go to voicemail. The voicemail was from a woman who identified herself as a receptionist from the Meridian Center. She said she was calling to confirm Natalie's follow-up appointment for the following Thursday and asked her to call back if she needed to reschedule. She left a number. My wife had a follow-up appointment at the same private clinic where she'd gone 6 days before telling me she was pregnant. I called the number the following morning from my office. I identified myself as Natalie's husband, said I'd received the message on her behalf, asked if I could confirm the appointment details. The receptionist, professional, brisk, said she couldn't share patient information but could confirm the appointment time if I gave her the date. I gave her the Thursday date. She confirmed it. I asked, as casually as I could manage, "Could you also just confirm the nature of the appointment?" My wife mentioned it, but I want to make sure I have the right information. A pause. Then, "I'm sorry, I really can't share clinical details. But if you'd like, your wife can call us directly to authorize the release of information to you." I thanked her and hung up. I sat in my office for 40 minutes and looked at the city through the window, the building I designed 3 years ago visible from where I sat, its glass facade catching the morning light, and I thought about what I actually believed was happening. And for the first time, I let myself think it directly, without softening it. What if there is no pregnancy? There are things you cannot ask your wife directly when you suspect something this large. The question itself, "Are you actually pregnant?" carries a weight that reshapes everything around it regardless of the answer. If she's telling the truth, the question is a wound that doesn't heal. If she's lying, the question gives her time to construct a response. I needed to know before I asked. I spent 3 days thinking about how to do this without becoming someone I didn't recognize. I set limits for myself. I would not go through her phone without her knowledge. I would not contact her colleagues at the hospital. I would not hire anyone. These felt important at the time. The maintenance of some ethical perimeter around the investigation I was conducting inside my own marriage. What I would do was verify the things I could verify. The midwife appointment was Thursday at 2 in the afternoon. Natalie had shown me the calendar entry. She'd been specific, a midwife named Karen at a GP surgery 15 minutes from our house. She said I could come if I wanted, but that it would mostly be administrative, registering, paperwork, not much to see. I said I had a client meeting. I didn't. I drove to the GP surgery at 1:30 and parked across the street, and I waited. At 1:58, Natalie's car pulled into the small car park. She went inside. I sat and watched the entrance and thought about the person I was becoming and decided that I was already too far in to stop now. 45 minutes later, she came out. She was carrying a small paper folder, the kind GP surgeries use for patient information packs, and she looked, from a distance, composed. Normal. The ordinary version of a woman leaving a routine appointment. I drove home by a different route and was back before she was. When she came in, I was in the kitchen. She set her bag down and I asked how it went. She said fine, routine, that Karen was lovely, that everything looked good. She put the paper folder on the counter. I looked at it and didn't touch it. That night, while she was showering, I opened it. Inside was a welcome leaflet from the surgery, a list of recommended dietary supplements, a page of general pregnancy information, and a single printed form, a registration document, partially filled in with Natalie's name and date of birth and address. The form had a field for gestational week. It was blank. It had a field for the name of the referring GP. It was blank. It had a field for the date of the last ultrasound scan. Also blank. The form was either incomplete or had never been processed. It looked less like a document from an appointment that had occurred and more like a document that had been picked up from a rack in a waiting room. I replaced everything exactly. I went to bed before she came out of the bathroom. I lay in the dark and listened to her settle beside me and breathed at the rate of someone who is asleep. And I thought about the ultrasound photo on the refrigerator and the warmth of those 11 weeks and the way she'd looked at me when I took her hand across the table and said, "We'll be okay." And I thought about Priya in the hallway saying something I hadn't heard, and Natalie saying, "I know what I'm doing." I called Priya the next morning. I told her I needed to talk. I told her I thought something was wrong. I asked her, directly, whether she knew something about the pregnancy that I didn't. There was a silence on the line that was longer than any innocent silence could justify. "Ethan," she said finally, "I told her to tell you." I gave myself one day before I spoke to Natalie. Not to prepare a speech. Not to plan the conversation strategically. I needed the day because something had happened to me when Priya said those 7 words, something physical, a kind of cold that started at the base of my sternum and spread outward. And I understood that if I confronted Natalie in that state, I would be functioning at the wrong frequency. Too raw, too destabilized. So I went to work. I looked at blueprints. I spoke to my client about load-bearing revisions. I had lunch alone at my desk and looked out the window at the building I designed and thought about structure, about what holds, about what gives way under sustained weight. I came home and cooked dinner. I set the table. I poured water into glasses, not wine, and I waited. Natalie came home at 6:30. She smelled of the hospital, that specific institutional smell that clung to her on long days. And she was tired in the way she was tired on difficult weeks. Not dramatically, but with a bone-level exhaustion that showed in the set of her shoulders. She sat down. She looked at the food and said it looked lovely. I sat across from her. I said, "I spoke to Priya today." The change was immediate and total. Not guilt. Exactly. Something more complex than that. A kind of reckoning. She'd been carrying this for 11 weeks, I realized. The specific weight of a sustained lie has a gravity of its own, and when the moment arrives that it ends, there is sometimes something that looks almost like relief. She put her fork down. "I know," she said. The 2 words hit me with the particular force of things confirmed rather than revealed. I'd known, or almost known, for 10 days. The knowing didn't make it less devastating. "Tell me everything," I said. She did. There was no pregnancy. There had never been a pregnancy. The scanned photo was real. She'd found it on a medical database through her work access, printed it on the right paper, altered the header details with the same design skills she'd developed doing administrative templates. She'd done it carefully and specifically, and with enough medical knowledge to make it convincing to a man who had no particular reason to look closely. She'd done it because she'd been afraid. That was the word she used, repeatedly. Afraid. Afraid that the separation conversation was becoming a decision. Afraid that I was going to leave and that if I left it would mean the 8 years had been wrong, that she'd been wrong, that the life she'd built with me would simply end. She'd panicked. She'd made a calculation that pregnancy would pause everything, that it would give her time to fix what was broken, that by the time I might find out the truth, she'd have rebuilt enough that it wouldn't matter. She'd thought about it for 2 days before she told me. She'd gone to the Meridian Center, a private fertility clinic, because she'd been trying to get pregnant genuinely for 3 months, quietly, without telling me, and they'd told her she was not currently pregnant, but that she had no particular fertility issues. She'd walked out of that appointment with a plan that she'd already begun to understand was wrong before she implemented it. "You tried to get actually pregnant," I said. "Yes." "For 3 months." "Without telling me." "Yes." I looked at the food on my plate. I looked at the ultrasound photo on the refrigerator, still there, 11 weeks on, that small comma shape in the dark. "Who else knows?" I asked. She hesitated. 1 second too long. "Priya," I said. "And who else?" Another pause. And this was the moment the story became something other than what I thought it was. Because the hesitation wasn't the hesitation of someone protecting a secret they'd shared. It was the hesitation of someone calculating how much of a larger truth they could safely tell. "My mother knows," Natalie said. "She's known from the beginning. I absorbed this." "Your mother," I said slowly. Natalie looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen before. Not guilt, not fear, but something more complicated. Exhaustion, maybe. The look of someone about to finally set down something they've been carrying for a very long time. "Ethan," she said, "there's more. There's something else you don't know. About why I was so afraid of you leaving. It's not just about us." She reached into her bag. She put a document on the table between us. A letter, formal, on legal stationery. I read it, and the entire shape of everything I thought I understood shifted, reorganized, settled into a configuration I hadn't anticipated. The letter was from a solicitor. It was addressed to Natalie. It referenced a property, a house I didn't know about, and an estate matter. Her father, who had died 4 years ago, had left behind debts that were now coming due, tied to a property her mother had been living in. The settlement required a significant sum within 6 months. If Natalie was single, legally separated from a husband, her credit standing and ability to secure the loan necessary to cover it collapsed. The bank's lending criteria, it turned out, were specifically dependent on a combined household income. She needed to be in a stable marriage. Not forever, just long enough. "You faked a pregnancy," I said quietly, "to save your mother's house." She said nothing. "That was the plan? Keep us together until you could sort the finances out, and then, what? Fake a miscarriage." "I hadn't thought that far," she said. "I know how that sounds." "How long?" I asked. "How long did you need?" "For more months." I sat back in my chair. I looked at the ceiling. I looked at the woman across the table from me, who I had loved, who I had been preparing to leave, who had panicked and made a decision so catastrophically wrong that it had simultaneously revealed her worst impulse and something that almost, not quite, but almost, explained it. "You could have just told me," I said, "about your mother, about the house. You could have just asked." She looked at me. Her eyes were wet, but she wasn't crying. The particular look of someone holding it back with everything they have. "Would you have stayed?" she asked. And I didn't answer, because I didn't know. I took the ultrasound photo off the refrigerator that night. I didn't throw it away. I put it in a drawer, the junk drawer in the kitchen where dead batteries and takeout menus and things without a proper home accumulate. And I closed it. And I stood at the refrigerator and looked at the magnet from Barcelona sitting alone where the photo had been. Natalie sat at the kitchen table and watched me. We didn't speak again that evening. There was nothing left that the immediate moment could contain. We'd reached the edge of what the night could hold, and everything beyond it was territory that required a different kind of time. I slept in the spare room, my former project room, boxes of blueprints along one wall, the smell of paper and old coffee. I lay on the narrow bed and looked at the ceiling and let my mind do what it needed to do, which was not think in straight lines but feel the irregular shape of what I'd been handed. 2 lies, not one. The pregnancy, and beneath it, the financial desperation she'd never disclosed. 2 separate deceits running in parallel. One constructed from medical knowledge and careful planning. One from years of quiet shame about a family situation she'd apparently never trusted me enough to share. The second one, in some ways, was the one I kept returning to. Because here was the question that wouldn't leave me alone in the dark of that spare room. How had we built 8 years together in which she'd been afraid to tell me something that real? What had I done, or not done, or been, or failed to be, that created a marriage in which Natalie's response to a genuine crisis was to build a fiction rather than speak? I didn't ask that question to let her off the hook. The deception was wrong. It was a profound violation of trust, of my autonomy, of the basic contract of a shared life. I had reorganized myself around a lie. I had withdrawn a conversation about leaving, which was a real and considered decision, because of something that didn't exist. Those weeks I'd felt that terrified joy, standing at the refrigerator with a city skyline magnet, believing in a child who was never coming. Those weeks had been taken from me. The grief of that is a specific kind of grief that doesn't have a name, and I've sat with it for a long time. But the question remained. In the days that followed, I did several things in an order that surprised me. I called a lawyer, not to file, but to understand. I called my brother Tom and told him everything, sitting in my car outside his house for 40 minutes while he processed it in real time. I did not call Natalie's mother. I wasn't ready for that conversation. I did, after 5 days, call Priya. I asked her the thing I needed to ask someone who had been in the room longer than me. Did she think Natalie was a person who had made a catastrophic error, or a person whose character was what those 11 weeks suggested? Priya was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "She's someone who loves too hard and thinks she can manage everything alone." She's been like that since I've known her. It's the best thing about her, and it's what destroys her. I thought about that for a long time. I went to see Natalie's mother, a woman named Gwen, 61 years old, who lived in the house that was at the center of everything. She made tea, and we sat in her living room, and she told me the whole story without my having to ask. The debts her husband had hidden for years, the property complications, the shame of it, the way Natalie had been managing it quietly since her father died, because Gwen couldn't face it herself. She didn't tell you, Gwen said, because she was protecting me. She didn't want you to think less of us. I looked at this woman, who was not responsible for what her daughter had done, but who was wrapped into it inextricably, and I felt something I hadn't expected. Something that wasn't forgiveness, exactly. More like the expansion of the picture. The thing that happens when a fixed image suddenly reveals its edges. Natalie and I began talking again. Carefully, without any predetermined destination. I engaged a counselor, not at her request, but at mine, because I knew that I didn't trust my own processing in this situation and I needed someone to help me think clearly. What emerged over the following weeks was not a clean narrative. It never became a simple story of betrayal and its aftermath. It became something messier and more truthful. A portrait of two people who had failed to speak honestly to each other across years, who had managed their fears privately in ways that had become, finally, incompatible with maintaining a shared life. I helped with the house. Not because I felt obligated, because when I sat with it honestly, the possibility of Gwen losing her home was not something I could stand by and watch when I had the means to help stabilize it. We restructured the loan. It wasn't charity. It was, and this is the word I kept coming back to, right? Not for Natalie. For Gwen, who was a separate person from the lie. Natalie and I did not reconcile. I want to be clear about that. What we did was something different. We chose to engage honestly, perhaps for the first time, with the reality of what our marriage had been and what it wasn't. We went back into the separation conversation we'd been having before the pregnancy announcement, and this time we had it fully, without the noise of a constructed crisis in the room with us. The conversation was long and painful, and several times I had to ask for it to pause so I could find my footing. But it was the most honest we had ever been with each other. And out of that honesty came the decision to separate, this time actually, with the clarity of people who understand what they're choosing and why. I moved out in early spring. A flat in the city, closer to work, close enough to familiar streets that I didn't feel entirely displaced. The building had large windows. I filled the space slowly, with things I chose deliberately. On the day I moved in, I unpacked a box and found, at the bottom of it, the city skyline magnet from Barcelona. I held it for a moment. Then I put it on the fridge, in my flat, and stood back and looked at it. It held nothing, just its own weight, its own small history, its own small life. I thought about the 11 weeks, the terrified joy, the child who wasn't coming. I thought about a woman who had loved me badly and feared losing me enough to do something she knew was wrong. I thought about the conversation we'd never had that might have prevented any of it, and whether the failure to have it was only hers or also mine. I didn't have an answer. I'm not sure I was meant to. What I had instead was a morning in a new flat with large windows and a small magnet, and the first day of something that wasn't yet shaped enough to name. Not recovery, not resolution, just the beginning of paying honest attention to what was actually there. The magnet caught the light. The room was quiet. Outside, the city went about its business, entirely indifferent, entirely itself. I made coffee. I sat by the window, and I started to figure out what I actually believed. The story of Ethan and Natalie is, on its surface, a story about a faked pregnancy. But beneath that surface, and this is what makes it genuinely disturbing, it is a story about a marriage in which two people had been gradually losing each other in silence, and in which one of them responded to that silence with a lie so elaborately constructed that it reveals the full depth of what was never being said. The pregnancy deception is not where the story begins. It begins in those 3 months before the announcement, when Natalie was quietly attempting to get pregnant without telling her husband. That detail is perhaps the most psychologically revealing in the entire narrative. She wasn't simply lying. She was trying to make the lie true. She wanted a real pregnancy, and when she discovered she didn't have one, she manufactured the next best thing. This tells us something important about the quality of her self-awareness in this period. She knew the separation was coming, and her instinct was not to address the marriage's actual problems, but to create a circumstance that would pause them. At what point do you think Natalie crossed the line she couldn't come back from? Was it the moment she found the skin image? Or earlier, when she started those 3 months of silent attempts? The deception didn't begin with a single dramatic decision. It accumulated, the way the worst kinds of choices always do. The financial revelation in Part 5 changes everything, and not in the way that exonerates Natalie, but in the way that expands the story beyond simple betrayal. The debt, the property, the mother's house. These elements reveal that Natalie was carrying a second enormous secret simultaneously. She had been managing her family's financial crisis alone for 4 years, in a marriage, without disclosure. And the question Ethan arrives at in the spare room is the story's most piercing insight. What had he been, or failed to be, that made speaking to him feel less possible than constructing an elaborate lie? This is not a question that reduces his victimhood. He was deceived. He had his autonomy removed. He experienced 11 weeks of emotion built on a foundation that didn't exist. But the question is honest, and it matters, because marriages don't become places where people can't speak in a single dramatic moment. They become those places gradually, through accumulated small silences, through the management of impression rather than the sharing of reality. Priya's description of Natalie is the story's most economical psychological portrait. She loves too hard and thinks she can manage everything alone. This is the specific personality type that produces this specific kind of damage. Not malicious, not calculating in the cold sense, but profoundly convinced that protecting the people she loves means shielding them from the true weight of things. The result is a woman who was always slightly performing stability rather than living it, who was, in the deepest sense, alone inside her marriage. Would you have stayed if she'd simply told you about her mother? This is the question Ethan asks himself and doesn't answer. It is also the question the story asks its listener. Because the most unsettling possibility, the one the story quietly insists upon, is that Natalie may have been right that the truth wouldn't have been enough, that the marriage was already too damaged for honesty to repair it, and that the lie was, in some terrible way, her attempt to buy time for something that was already lost. Ethan's decision to help with Gwen's house is the story's most quietly radical moment. He separates the people from the event, the woman from her daughter's deception, and responds to a human need he can address rather than withdrawing entirely. This is not weakness. It is a specific kind of moral precision, the ability to hold complexity without resolving it into a simpler shape. Pull back far enough from this story, and what you're looking at is a study in the architecture of hidden things. Both Natalie and Ethan were carrying structures the other couldn't see. His was the growing decision to leave. Hers was the financial crisis and the fear underneath everything. And the tragedy is not simply that these hidden things collided. It's that neither of them had built the kind of marriage in which hidden things could be safely brought into the open. The faked pregnancy is the story's most visible event, but it is not its cause. It is a symptom. It is what happens when a person becomes so convinced that the truth is too dangerous to tell that they substitute a constructed reality in its place. Natalie didn't deceive Ethan because she was dishonest by nature. She deceived him because she had been, for years, building a version of herself that could hold everything together. And when that version finally cracked under pressure, the lie was the only tool she could reach. The deeper pattern here is self-deception before external deception. Natalie had to convince herself, first, that this was manageable, that she could control the outcome, that the lie would buy enough time for reality to align with what she'd invented. This is the structure of all sustained deceptions. They require the deceiver to maintain a parallel internal fiction, which is ultimately more exhausting and more damaging than the original truth would ever have been. What the story leaves us with is not resolution, but recalibration. Ethan doesn't emerge triumphant. He emerges honest, which is a different and harder thing. He acknowledges his own silence. He helps Gwen not from sentiment, but from values. He separates from Natalie not with rage, but with the kind of clarity that only becomes possible when the performance is finally over. The city skyline magnet on his new refrigerator holds nothing. That is, in the end, the most truthful image the story offers. The same small object, the same memory of Barcelona, freed now from the weight of what it was asked to commemorate. Just itself. Just there. Sometimes, starting over doesn't look like a beginning. It looks like a single ordinary object in the morning light of a quiet room, and the slow, uncertain work of deciding what you actually believe.